Chenoa Black Horse found the girl sitting in the ruins of the burned trading post, her finger tracing endless spirals in the ash-covered ground. The child couldn't have been more than 8 summers, her calico dress torn and stained with smoke, her dark hair matted with dust and dried tears. The trading post had been attacked 3 days ago. Comanche raiders, the soldier said, though Chenoa knew better. She'd seen the boot prints among the horse hooves, heard the survivors' whispered accounts of blue uniforms mixed with war paint. "Child," Chenoa said softly in English, then repeated in Apache, "Ishkeen." The girl didn't look up. Her finger continued its endless pattern, spiral after spiral, each one identical to the last, carved into the ash with the precision of someone who had found the only motion that made sense in a world suddenly stripped of meaning. Chenoa approached slowly, her moccasins silent on the debris-scattered ground. She'd learned caution in the 2 seasons since losing her own children, learned to move through grief like a hunter tracking wounded prey, careful, patient, ready to retreat if the pain proved too dangerous. She settled onto the ground an arm's length from the girl, close enough to offer presence, far enough to avoid crowding the fragile space around broken things. The spirals continued. Round and round, each one beginning where the last had ended, an endless cycle that seemed to hold all the world's sorrow in its turning. Chenoa recognized the pattern. Her own son had drawn similar shapes in the days before the fever took him. "I know about spirals," Chenoa said quietly. The girl's finger paused for just a moment, then resumed its tracing. Chenoa reached into her medicine pouch and withdrew a piece of soft deerskin, placing it on the ground between them. With one finger, she began her own spiral, this one traced in the dust that had settled on the leather's surface. "My grandmother taught me that spirals are the shape of time," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "How the seasons turn, how grief moves through the heart." The girl's hand stopped. For the first time she looked up. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale, vast, empty of everything except the kind of knowledge that children should never carry. Chenoa felt her breath catch, seeing in those eyes the same hollowness that had stared back at her from still water in the months after her own loss. "What's your name, little one?" The girl's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. She pointed to herself, then to the spirals in the ash, as if to say they were the same thing, endless, meaningless, necessary. "My name is Chenoa," she said. "It means dove. My mother said I was born when the white doves came to drink from our spring." The girl tilted her head slightly, listening. "Would you like me to sit with you while you draw?" A small nod, almost invisible, but there. Chenoa settled more comfortably into the ash and began her own pattern beside the girl's spirals, not copying them, but creating something parallel, a conversation in the language of repetitive motion and shared silence. They sat together as the sun moved across the sky, 2 figures in the ruins of what had once been a place where different peoples came to trade. Now it was just another scar on the landscape, another reminder that the world was always one moment away from burning down. But in the midst of the destruction, 2 hands continued their patient work, creating something beautiful from ash and dust and the simple act of not being alone. For 7 days, Chenoa returned to the ruins. Each morning she would find the girl in the same spot, finger tracing the same spirals. Each day, Chenoa would settle beside her and add her own patterns to the dust. Sometimes spirals, sometimes other shapes that came from the deeper places where memory lived. On the 8th day, the girl spoke. "They took my mama." The words were barely a whisper, cracked from disuse and tears, but they fell between them like stones dropped into still water. Chenoa's hand paused in its tracing. "Who took her?" "The men with painted faces. They came in the night. Mama hid me under the grain sacks, told me not to move no matter what I heard." The girl's finger never stopped its spiral motion. "I heard her screaming, then nothing." Chenoa felt the familiar twist in her chest, the way grief recognized itself across the space between one story and another. "What about your father?" "Papa went to Santa Fe with the wagon train. He was supposed to come back before the snow." The girl's voice was matter-of-fact, the tone children used when the world had taught them that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. That was 2 moons ago. Chenoa understood. The trading routes had become increasingly dangerous, and many men who left their families never returned. "What's your name, little one? Your real name?" The girl considered this as if names were something she'd temporarily forgotten how to carry. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah McKenna. But Mama sometimes called me her little meadowlark because I used to sing." Used to sing. The words carried the weight of a world that had been lost. "I had children too," Chenoa said softly. "A son and a daughter. Kestrel was my boy. He would have seen 10 summers this season. Sage was my daughter, 7 summers, like the flowers she was named for." Sarah's spiraling paused. "What happened to them?" "The spotted sickness. It came through our camp like wildfire, took half the children before the medicine people could do anything." Chenoa's voice remained steady, but her hands had begun to tremble. "My husband tried to take them to the army doctor at the fort, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Sarah understood. "Do you miss them?" Sarah asked. "Every breath I take." They sat in silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Around them, the ruins bore witness to their conversation. Broken beams reaching toward the sky, charred walls that still smelled of smoke and loss. "My mama used to say that missing someone was just love with nowhere to go," Sarah said finally. Chenoa felt the words pierce something in her chest that had been carefully armored for months. Your mama was wise. She knew about plants, could make tea that would stop a fever, poultices that would heal cuts. Sarah's finger had resumed its spiral pattern, but now it seemed less frantic, more purposeful. "She was teaching me before. Would you like to learn more about the plants?" Sarah looked up, and for the first time since Chenoa had found her, something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't despair either flickered in her winter sky eyes. "Could you teach me Apache medicine? The old ways?" Chenoa smiled, feeling something that had been frozen in her chest begin to thaw. "I could teach you some things, if you'd like to stop drawing spirals long enough to walk with me." Sarah considered this gravely, then swept her hand across the ash, erasing the patterns she'd been creating for days. "Maybe it's time for different shapes." Chenoa stood and extended her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it, small fingers wrapping around weathered palm, trust offered like water in the desert. Together, they walked away from the ruins, toward the creek that ran between the desert and the mountains, where plants grew that knew the old songs of healing. The creek ran clear and cold between red stone banks, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep places where the earth remembered older times. Chenoa led Sarah to a bend where cottonwoods offered shade, and the water moved slowly enough to let the healing plants take root. "Osha," Chenoa said, pointing to a plant with white umbrella flowers. "Good for lung sickness." Sarah knelt beside the plant, her small hands hovering over the leaves without touching. "Mama called it bear root. Said bears ate it when they were sick." "Your mama knew the old names too." They spent the morning gathering: willow bark for pain, manzanita berries for stomach troubles, sage for purifying ceremonies. Sarah moved through the plants like someone rediscovering a forgotten language, her fingers gentle on stems and leaves. "This one," Sarah said, stopping beside a low shrub with silvery leaves. "Mama used it for women's troubles, but I don't remember what she called it." "Kota," Chenoa said, "desert tea." She showed Sarah how to identify the plant by its distinctive smell. "But you're young yet. Some knowledge comes when it's needed." They filled their gathering baskets slowly, taking only what they needed, offering tobacco and prayers to the plant spirits, as Chenoa's grandmother had taught her. "Chenoa," Sarah said as they prepared to return, "what happened to your husband? After the children died?" Chenoa's hand stilled on the basket she was weaving. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Running Wolf he was a man who felt things deeply, too deeply maybe. She resumed her weaving. "When the children died, part of him died with them, the part that knew how to hope." Sarah waited, understanding that some stories needed space to unfold. He started riding out alone, looking for the ones who brought the sickness to our camp. Said someone had to pay for what was taken from us. Chenoa's voice grew quieter. I tried to tell him that grief wasn't something you could cure with revenge, but anger was easier for him to carry than sorrow. Did he find them? He found soldiers, bluecoats on patrol near the fort. They found his body 3 days later, full of bullets, his war paint still fresh. Chenoa tied off the end of the basket. The army said he was a hostile. The Apache said he was a grieving father. Maybe they were both right. Sarah reached across the space between them and touched Chenoa's hand. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, but it carried understanding. Is that why you help me? Because you miss them? Chenoa looked at the child, this pale, wounded girl who had somehow found her way into the empty spaces where her own children used to live. I think sometimes the heart finds ways to keep loving, even when everything it loved is gone. Sarah nodded gravely. Mama used to say that love was like water. Even when you pour it out, there's always more where it came from. They sat by the creek as the afternoon light began to slant through the cottonwood leaves. Two people who had lost their families finding something new in the space between memory and hope. Will you teach me about ceremonies too? Sarah asked suddenly. The Apache way of honoring the dead? Chenoa felt her breath catch. Apache death ceremonies were sacred things, not meant for outsider eyes. But looking at this child, who had been left with nothing but spirals and silence, she understood that some rules were meant to be bent when the heart required healing. There are some things I can teach you, she said carefully. Ways to honor what was lost without binding the spirits to grief. Sarah's answer came not in words, but in the way she moved closer until their shoulders touched. Tomorrow, Chenoa said, I'll show you how to build a proper remembering fire. They built the fire on a mesa overlooking the valley, where the wind could carry smoke and prayers to the 4 directions. Chenoa had spent the morning gathering specific woods, oak for strength, pine for purification, mesquite for the sweetness that honored departed spirits. Sarah watched as Chenoa arranged the kindling in a pattern that seemed random, but wasn't. A spiral, she realized, like the ones she'd been drawing in the ash. But this one built to reach skyward instead of turning endlessly inward. The fire is a doorway, Chenoa explained as she struck flint to steel. It helps the spirits find their way home, and it helps the living let go of the parts of their hearts that have been holding too tight. The flames caught and began to climb, sending smoke into the clear afternoon air. Chenoa opened her medicine pouch and withdrew tobacco, cedar, sage, the sacred plants that carried prayers upward. Do you have something that belonged to your mother? She asked Sarah. The girl reached into her pocket and withdrew a small wooden button, carved with a rose pattern, from her Sunday dress. Chenoa nodded. And your father? Sarah's face clouded. I don't know if he's dead. What if I'm burning something for someone who might still be alive? Then we burn it for the part of him that died when he lost you and your mother, for the man he was before grief changed him. Sarah reached into her other pocket and withdrew a small piece of carved bone, part of a checker set her father had been making. Chenoa added her own offerings, a braid of hair from her daughter, a small flute her son had carved, a copper bracelet her husband had worn into his final battle. Now we speak their names, she said. We tell the fire who we're releasing so they can find their way. Mary McKenna, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. She made the best cornbread in 3 territories. She could sing birds down from trees. She loved Papa even when he made bad jokes. Chenoa waited, understanding that some rituals required their own timing. Joseph McKenna, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. He could fix anything with wheels or gears. He taught me to whistle. He promised to bring me a music box from Santa Fe. Chenoa felt tears gathering as she listened to the child speak the sacred names, transforming them from weights that dragged at the heart into gifts offered freely to the sky. Sage Black Horse, Chenoa said when Sarah fell silent. She laughed like water over stones. She could weave grass into dolls that looked real enough to breathe. Kestrel Black Horse, He could track a mouse through rocks. He carved animals so lifelike they seemed ready to run away. Running Wolf Blackhorse. He loved with his whole heart or not at all. He sang the old songs in a voice that made eagles circle lower to listen. They fed their offerings to the flames, watching as the fire consumed the physical remnants and transformed them into smoke that rose toward the darkening sky. The sun had begun to set, painting the western horizon in shades of gold and red. "Is it finished?" Sarah asked as the last wisps of smoke disappeared. "The letting go part is finished," Genoa said. "Now comes the carrying forward part." She reached into her pouch and withdrew 2 small stones, river rocks worn smooth by countless seasons of water and weather. She handed one to Sarah and kept one for herself. "These are memory stones," she explained. "Not for holding on to grief, but for holding on to love. When you miss them so much it feels like drowning, you hold this stone and remember that love doesn't die. It just changes form." Sarah closed her fingers around the warm stone, feeling its weight settle into her palm, like something she'd been looking for without knowing it. "What happens now?" she asked. Genoa looked out over the valley spread below them, where the lights of scattered settlements twinkled like earthbound stars. "Now we learn how to be a different kind of family," she said. "Not the kind we were born into, but the kind we choose, the kind that grows from shared sorrow and shared hope." Sarah moved closer until their shoulders touched. "Can I stay with you? Really stay?" Genoa felt something that had been broken in her chest for 2 seasons finally begin to mend. Not back to what it was, but into something new, something that could hold both sorrow and joy without breaking. "For as long as you need," she said. "For as long as we need each other." They sat together on the mesa as full darkness claimed the sky, 2 people who had lost everything learning to believe in the possibility of finding something else, not replacement, but continuation. The fire burned down to coals, then to ash, then to memory. But the love it had carried skyward remained, woven into the fabric of the night like stars that shine brightest in the deepest darkness. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the desert in white silence. Genoa and Sarah had spent the autumn months preparing, gathering firewood, drying meat, storing roots and herbs in the small cave where they'd made their winter camp. But preparation could only do so much against the kind of cold that reached into bones and stayed there. Sarah woke one morning to find Genoa burning with fever, her breath coming in short gasps, her skin hot and dry despite the cold that made their breath visible in the cave's dim interior. "The lung sickness," Genoa whispered when she saw Sarah's frightened face. "Sometimes it comes back when the body is tired, when winter presses too hard." Sarah knew about lung sickness. It had taken her mother's cousin the previous winter. The memory made her hands shake as she tried to remember everything Genoa had taught her about healing. "Osha," she said, more to herself than to Genoa, "and willow bark for the fever." But they'd used most of their Osha treating an Apache child 2 weeks earlier. Sarah looked at their dwindling medicine supplies and realized it wouldn't be enough. "I have to go back to the creek," she told Genoa. "There's more Osha growing there." Genoa tried to sit up, alarm cutting through the fever haze. "No, too dangerous. The snow. You'll lose the trail. I know the way. You taught me to read the land. Sarah, listen to me." Genoa's voice carried authority. "That storm outside isn't finished, if you get caught in it." But Sarah was already pulling on her warmest clothes, wrapping herself in the heavy blanket they'd traded for with Mexican shepherds. She couldn't lose Genoa, not when she'd finally found someone who understood the shape of her grief. "I'll follow the creek bed," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Even in snow, water makes a trail. I'll be back before dark." Genoa reached out with a trembling hand and caught Sarah's wrist. "If something happens to you, if I lose you too." "You won't," Sarah said. "I'm not going anywhere. We're family now, remember?" She kissed Genoa's fevered forehead and stepped out into the storm. The world had transformed overnight into something alien and hostile. Snow fell so thick she could barely see her own feet, and the wind carried ice crystals that stung her face like tiny knives. The familiar landmarks were buried or obscured. Sarah followed the creek as she'd promised, but the water was mostly frozen now, its voice reduced to a faint gurgling beneath layers of ice. Twice she lost the trail and had to backtrack, precious time slipping away as the storm intensified. When she finally reached the place where the osha grew, she found the plants buried under 3 feet of snow. She dug with her bare hands, her fingers quickly going numb, searching by feel for the distinctive roots that might save Chenoa's life. By the time she'd gathered enough medicine, the brief winter daylight was already beginning to fade. The return journey would be even more treacherous. She started back, following her own tracks when she could find them, relying on instinct and prayer when the snow had covered them completely. The wind seemed determined to push her off course. Darkness fell before she was halfway home. Sarah pressed on by feel and memory, her feet so cold she could no longer feel them, her hands so numb she could barely grip the medicine pouch. She might have wandered in circles for hours, she might have frozen to death within sight of safety, but something, intuition, luck, or the spirits of the children Chenoa had lost, guided her steps until she saw the faint glow of firelight spilling from their cave entrance. Sarah stumbled inside, more dead than alive, and collapsed beside the fire. Chenoa, despite her fever, helped her remove her ice-crusted clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets while water heated for the healing tea. "Foolish child," Chenoa whispered, but her voice was full of love and relief. "Brave, foolish child." Sarah's teeth were chattering too hard for speech, but she managed to press the medicine pouch into Chenoa's hands. They brewed the osha tea together, their movements clumsy with cold and fever, but their hearts warm with the knowledge that they had chosen to save each other. The storm raged for 3 more days, but the fever broke on the 2nd night. They spent the winter weeks recovering together, sharing the quiet intimacy that comes from having faced death side by side and chosen life instead. When spring finally arrived, it found them changed, not just by survival, but by the deep knowledge that they belonged to each other now in ways that transcended loss, ways that even winter couldn't break. 2 years later, Sarah stood at the edge of the mesa where she and Chenoa had performed the letting go ceremony. Below her in the valley, a small settlement had grown up around the ruins of the old trading post. Not Mexican, not Apache, but something new. Families who had lost everything and found each other. Chenoa approached from behind, her steps careful on the rocky ground. Her hair was streaked with more grey now, and lines around her eyes spoke of seasons spent squinting into desert sun, but her movements held the quiet strength of someone who had learned to carry hope alongside grief. "The children are asking for their evening story," Chenoa said, settling beside Sarah. Sarah smiled. There were 6 children in their care now, Apache orphans, Mexican children whose families had been lost to raids, 2 white children whose wagon train had been attacked, all of them drawn together by the simple fact that they had nowhere else to go. "Which story tonight?" Sarah asked. "Miguel wants to hear about the time you walked through the blizzard to save my life." "Again," Sarah laughed. "He's going to grow up thinking I'm some kind of hero instead of just a scared little girl who got lucky." "Maybe that's the same thing," Chenoa said. "Maybe heroes are just scared people who choose to act anyway." They looked down at the settlement, where cooking fires were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The trading post had been rebuilt, but differently this time, designed by people who understood that some bridges couldn't be burned. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Taking me in, all of us?" Chenoa considered the question seriously. "I regret that you needed taking in. I regret the circumstances that brought us together. But I don't regret the family we became." Sarah nodded, understanding. Over the years, she'd learned to separate the love from the loss, to honor what had been while embracing what was. There were still nights when she woke crying for her mother, still moments when Chenoa's eyes grew distant with memories. But they'd also learned that grief didn't have to be the end of the story, that sometimes it could be the beginning of something else. Not better, not worse, but different, necessary. Maria found more children last week, Sarah said. 3 little ones whose family died crossing the desert. She's asking if we have room. Do we? Sarah looked down at the settlement again, calculating space and resources and the infinite capacity of hearts that had already been broken and rebuilt. We'll make room, she said finally. We always do. Chenoa smiled and stood, extending her hand to help Sarah up from the rocks. Come on then. Let's go tell the children about heroes and blizzards and the things we do for love. They walked down the mesa together, 2 women who had found each other in the ruins of their separate losses and built something that could shelter others from the storms that would inevitably come. At the rebuilt trading post, children gathered around the fire pit, their faces eager for the stories that helped them understand their own survival. Sarah looked at each of them, Apache and Mexican and white, all of them marked by loss, all of them carried forward by the simple fact that someone had chosen to love them. Once upon a time, she began, using the English words her mother had taught her alongside the Apache phrases Chenoa had shared, there was a woman who lost everything, and a little girl who lost everything, and they found each other in the place where everything ends, and learned that sometimes that's where everything begins. The children leaned forward, hungry for stories that promised survival, that suggested love could be rebuilt from ashes, that hinted at the possibility of finding family in the most unlikely places. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain, promising growth for the seeds they'd planted in the hard ground around their homes. Some things ended, some things endured, and some things grew stronger in the spaces between loss and hope. The spiral had become a circle, complete and unbroken, holding all of them safely within its embrace.